This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a Henry Luce Foundation-funded project hosted by Northeastern University that promotes public scholarship on religion. I highly recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website, sacred-rights.org, that's WRITES, or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. In recent years, the work of Hasan Minhaj, Kumail Nanjiani, Ramin Youssef, and Aziz Ansari took off and led to comedy specials, starring roles in films, and television series. Religion and Islam comes up in the work of these comedians, who are all competing against a cultural backdrop of post-9/11 United States, in which Islam is often racialized. The ways these comedians interact with religion is powerful, and I first started realizing the power beyond just comedy for these stand-ups, while interestingly reading Twitter and seeing religious studies professors who have appeared on this show talking about assigning portions of some of these television shows in their classes because of the ways religion was portrayed and dissected. And sure enough, scholars are paying attention to the work of Muslim stand-up comedians. My guest on this episode is Dr. Samah Choudhury. Dr. Choudhury is an assistant professor of religious studies at Ithaca College. She speaks and writes about Islam, humor, and the politics that accompany what it means to be socially legible in the United States. Her current book manuscript looks at the ways that Islam and Muslims are articulated through stand-up comedy and how they speak back to broader transnational practices and discourses of race, masculinity, and secularism. You can follow her work on Twitter at Samah Choudhury. Please enjoy our conversation. Dr. Samah Choudhury, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you for having me.
I'm delighted to have you here today, and I'm wondering if you can just spend a moment and introduce yourself to the audience, however you see fit.
Sounds great. So I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Ithaca College in New York. And my research surrounds American Muslim humor and the politics that accompany what it means for American Muslims to be socially legible in the United States. So I'm writing a book right now on how Islam and Muslims are articulated through the medium of stand-up comedy and the ways that they're recognized and or obscured due to broader understandings and operations of race and gender in American secularism today.
Wonderful. I'm curious about these areas of expertise, and I love that you're involved in and interested in humor, by the way. I think that this is an absolutely fascinating and fantastic area of conversation, and because it just kind of lends a different type of tone to the conversation that we're going to have today, because we are focusing on comedy. And I absolutely love that, because something that we need more in this world is humor and laughter. And it's something that I care deeply about. So I'm so excited to hear your thoughts on that. But I want to frame your areas of expertise in your experiences that led you into this particular academic trajectory and path. And I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about your academic journey and maybe some turning points about why you're interested in Islam, why you're interested in comedy, and maybe a little bit about masculinity as well.
Yeah, sure. So, it's not as funny to talk about these kind of origin moments for me. We're recording this the day before the 20th anniversary of the events of September 11th, which, of course, most folks that were alive that day have very vivid memories of, including myself. At that time, I was a middle schooler in Southwest Michigan. My brown-skinned Bangladeshi family had just moved to this very white, highly homogenous part of the state a few months back. And I'm sitting in my orchestra classroom when my teacher turns to me and asks me why, and she calls them my people, why my people would do something like this. And, of course, in that moment, everyone in the classroom cranes their heads back and looks at me. It's this highly alienating and disassociative moment um, that was indicative of difference, right? And it was a difference that was certainly there before, but one that I would be highly aware of for the remainder of my life.
Mm,
And it's, it was a simple question. I think I, at that moment, was like, I don't know, in response to her, and the class moves on. But it was a really formative moment, right? And I think if you look at the ways that a lot of people, a lot of Muslims in the United States in the days and years after 9/11, um, kind of took up this mantle of responding to the event. My family took it upon ourselves to convince the skeptical people around us that Muslims were just like them, right?
mm,
My mom would pack up our family minivan on the weekends, would haul me and my 3-year-old brother to churches around our home state in Michigan, and we'd meet with congregations and implore them to just understand that we were good Muslims.
mm.
Um, you can kind of put that phrase in quotes, I think,
Yeah,
that there are bad apples, but they don't speak for us. We love our country. We're upstanding, productive American citizens. And so that rhetoric is born out of, and I have the language for this now in a way that I didn't as a seventh grader.
sure.
That rhetoric's born out of self-preservation. My parents were recent immigrants, felt this compulsion to react through these kinds of apologetics where, we would demonstrate our value on the basis of how similar we were to other white Christian Americans, and that if we just did that enough, the public opinion needle would swing in our direction, and our presence in the United States would no longer be viewed suspect. Now we know that that was not necessarily the case.
Right.
There's a lot of really great journalism um, now in this moment, actually, about how very much that was not the case. Even the events of the last several years, right? We had a president who openly and very cavalierly called for a Muslim ban and Muslim registries, right? And this kind of ideology is built on exclusion and oppression, but it's not unique to just Muslims. Um, and so that's something that I would say it was another turning point for me, was the realization of how the fact that other minoritized communities in the United States have not just gone through this before, but it is these same types of processes and practices and operations of white supremacy and kind of ideologies of exclusion and difference that were working their ways through different communities like Muslims. And so even today, Islamophobia is worse than in those weeks after 9/11. And
Mm,
that's something to keep in mind.
mm. So, how did you decide to pursue this as a profession? Because obviously, this is a very personal part of your story, but like it doesn't mean that you had to go into it as like an academic path. You know what I mean? So, what was it about these topics and contents that inspired you to pursue it professionally and intellectually as well?
Yeah, I think it was a desire to understand it beyond simply my own personal experiences, to kind of connect dots and again see these connections between not just the experiences of other Muslims, but to also see how this fits into the um, larger ideas of racial formations, of gender and religion, and how these things operate in society. And so my career took a pretty winding trajectory. In undergrad, my degree was in political science and Middle Eastern studies. I imagined, and I think the way a lot of these programs are set up, certainly in the United States, if you are interested in area studies or particular regions of the world, that means you are going to study them through the purview of U.S. national interests. And after college, all roads point to Washington in that way. So I spent a few years working in D.C. at a nonprofit that focused primarily on democracy assistance and elections and in different parts of the world. And I was working, for their Middle East program on elections in Jordan and Egypt and Yemen. It coincided with the Arab Spring, but in a lot of ways, it really also exposed for me the the seedy underbelly of how Washington works and how money gets thrown at problems to just try and get the best result for quote unquote us without really a lot of deep understanding of these regions and the dynamics that are animating what we're seeing. So I knew I needed to go back to grad school to understand that a little bit more. I got a master's degree in Middle Eastern studies, and then eventually went on for a PhD in religious studies.
Gotcha. Well, something that before we get into comedy specifically, you said a term earlier that I'd have never heard on this show before in the 200 plus episodes that I've done, and that is the term socially legible. And I'm wondering if you can explain what that means, because I think when we dive into the work of comedians that you look at, that the term socially legible is going to be essential to that conversation. So maybe you can define that and talk about that a little bit for our listeners.
Yeah, when I use the term socially legible, um, I'm asking, I think maybe in words that are a little obscure and perhaps a little academic, but really what it means to be seen, right? What it means to be seen as another person and what being a person actually means. Um, a person of value and what values we then kind of confer onto people.
Hmm.
Um, when it comes to Muslims, there's several boxes that have to be checked. And my argument is that humor is one of them. We can talk a little bit more about why that is.
Gotcha. Why comedy? What drew you down this particular path of interest within your studies?
Well, I think in what do we call the last decade, the year of the 2010s,
Sure, I
the
guess
tens. It's
we'll
hard,
work on
right?
that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, during that time, we saw a number of Muslim comedians kind of um, not just explode on the stage, but really experience a precipitous rise, I would say, in the comedy world. And that, obviously was fun and interesting to watch as somebody who enjoys comedy and stand up. Um, but it was also a curious moment. And so at first, I think my interests were thinking about, notions of representation and how meaningful it might be for American Muslims to see people like them on these kinds of national platforms. But beyond just the representation question, I was also interested in why. Why them? Why were they all men? Um, and why were they also all South Asian? And these are questions that I then kind of took up in more formal study in my dissertation work.
Was the coincidence, or maybe not, maybe it's not a coincidence at all, that they were all men? I'm wondering if that led to your specific interest in masculinity as well, because like I'm reading your academic bio and it specifically mentions masculinity. I'm wondering if this is something you just happened into, or if masculinity was something you chose because it could have been femininity or masculinity, but it's very specifically masculinity, and I'm wondering if that's why.
Yeah, well, a lot of my graduate work, my advisor is a scholar of gender theory, um, and I am very much a student of hers. So in that way, gender is everywhere, just as much as these other racial constructions are, just as much as constructions of religion are as well. Um, I don't think it's a coincidence that these are all men. And as a result of that, I think we need to try and understand why, which means bringing masculinity to the fore, and the constructions of masculinity in particular that they're operating against, and then also kind of articulating themselves.
Mm. I love that you mentioned that they're working against as well. That seems to be a fascinating thread. Can you say just a little bit more about that? Because that is kind of gripping me at the moment.
Sure. Well, I would say that, Muslims who live in the United States, Muslim subjects, if we can even call them that, um, are minoritized and therefore are operating from a place of againstness, to use a term that Sylvia Chan Malik uses in her book, Being Muslim.
I love that book. She's been on the
Yeah.
show. I love that book a lot.
Right. And she's given us this notion of againstness, which is really fruitful for, I think, thinking about the place that Muslims kind of occupy in their quest for social legibility. So there are dominant and hegemonic notions of masculinity, of race, that are already legible in ways that they have to then kind of contend with, wrestle with, in order to kind of, wrest away a little bit of that legibility for themselves. So
Hmm.
that's what I'm thinking about here.
I love it. Well, I want to discuss a specific piece of writing that I read of yours recently. It's an article titled Religion, Race, and Media, Comedian Hasan Minhaj and Muslim Humor. And I'm wondering if you can talk to me a little bit about the importance of Hasan Minhaj in general and why you are like interested in his work and focusing on what he does.
Yeah. So, I mentioned that there was like a group of Muslim comedians who all kind of came onto the national stage around the same time. Hassan Minhaj is one of them. I also look at comedians like Aziz Ansari and Kumail Nanjiani. And
Hmm.
so through the work of these three men, I'm thinking about the medium of humor. And we might ask why humor? But we already know the answer to that before we even kind of venture the question. There's an association between Muslims and humor that we implicitly recognize. Perhaps it's less a relationship between Muslims and humor and more a relationship between Muslims and a lack of humor. And that relationship, I think, especially in the last 40 years, is something that feels and indeed has been made to feel natural,
Hmm.
right? That Muslims are stoic, they're unfriendly, they're stubborn, they're quick to fly off the handle when you offend them. They just can't take a joke.
Mm.
And so there's global flashpoints in our recent history that undergird this assumption. We have what gets dubbed the Salman Rushdie affair in the 90s. We have the Danish cartoon controversy in 2005, the Charlie Hebdo shooting in 2015. So these social debates that follow these events have boiled down to two persistent questions, which is why can't Muslims take a joke
Mm.
about themselves, about anything? And is Islam then compatible with modernity? Now, there have been scholars who take up this charge. There are people who argue that we need to just look at the earliest episodes of Islamic history for proof of Muslim humor. There's folks who have studied, for example, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad and his interactions with um, his companions, and how they were always jovial and joking around with each other, so that if indeed we want to say that Muslims have a lack of humor, it's certainly not because um, the Prophet himself was such a person. This is something that develops later, and is worth studying in that way.
Mm.
There's people who look at the Quran itself and find instances throughout the Quran. Um, Others also point to the fact that, Hassan Minhaj, Aziz Ansari, Kumail Nanjiani, these are not the first American Muslim comedians. There was actually a lot of Muslim comedy in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, which was also a moment where laughter came to be a symbol of American freedom and a value of American democracy in a way that was not associated with the Taliban, for example.
Hmm.
So, what I'm trying to articulate through my work and through the study of somebody like Hassan Minhaj is how and why humor, this ability to joke and to take a joke, how that has become a de facto principle of modernity, how it's become this admirable personality trait of a modern person. And I think without an understanding of how humor and modernity actually come to stand in for one another and what roles gender and race and religion play in that development, then our discourses and our scholarship, and the ways we understand people, each other, all of that is doomed to kind of continue returning to these same tired, persistent premises, right? Where Islam is pitted against modernity with no greater comprehension as to why that premise is so naturally assumed at the outset of it all.
Yeah, well, and it seems like this is the backdrop with which Muslim comedians must compete. Like this is like these experiences and these assumptions of the society in our post 9/11 world is something that these particular comedians like are always like reminding themselves of, and I'm wondering what that mental turmoil is like for them within their own work too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that turmoil we can see present in the work of all of these comedians. So we mentioned Hassan Minhaj, who kind of gets his national start as a correspondent on Comedy Central's Daily Show with Jon Stewart.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he ends up getting a stand-up special on Netflix in 2017 called Homecoming King. That gets rave reviews. He walks away with a Peabody for that. And it leads directly to another venture with Netflix, which was pretty enduring. Within months, they had offered him a 32 episode order for a new comedy show called Patriot Act, which actually only recently was canceled. And he would be the headliner for that.
Yeah.
That show won an Emmy. It won 2 Webby Awards. It got another Peabody Award for Minhaj. Kumail Nanjiani was also somebody who had comedy specials on Comedy Central. He was cast in the HBO show Silicon Valley that ran for 6 seasons until 2019. And then in 2017, he penned a screenplay about the story of his marriage to his current wife. Which got the attention of Judd Apatow, whom we all know. He agreed to produce it. It ended up becoming a feature-length film called The Big Sick. It premiered at Sundance, was such a hit, got acquired by Amazon at that point. Several nominations at the award show circuit in 2017, including an Oscar nomination for the screenplay itself. And then I think the most famous person, and famous here for maybe a variety of reasons, is Aziz Ansari, who a lot of folks will know from the NBC show Parks and Recreation. He played
Mm-hmm.
Tom Haverford. That also got the attention of Netflix. He produced a popular series called Master of None with them. This premiered in 2015, rave reviews. New York Times called it the best comedy straight out of the gate. And it ran for 2 seasons initially. A third season is up on Netflix now. But that also won a Peabody. It won 2 Emmys. Aziz Ansari won a Golden Globe for his acting. He was the first Asian American to win that award for acting. So he's famous for that. Another reason a lot of folks might know him is because of his Me Too moment,
Mm-hmm.
where a website, babe.net, which is now defunct, published a story written by a woman who said that he had actually assaulted her
Mm-hmm.
on what had been a date gone wrong. And this kind of sparked a very ranging discussion among the literati as to whether or not he had committed assault, if he had just been on a bad date, and what the lines of consent are in our society.
Mm. Well, and then another name that's springing to mind. I don't know if you know. I don't know how much you followed the work of Ramin Youssef as well. Have you followed Rami's work at all? And I'm wondering if you have any commentary or thoughts on Rami as well on Hulu.
Yeah, so Rami is somebody who is, I would say, like one of the latest entrants to this world of Muslim comedy. Because my work is focusing on a particular time period where I'm kind of centering myself around the years, 2014 through 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Rami is a blip, I would say, in those years. He's also much younger than these three.
Gotcha.
But yeah, Rami has this show on Hulu that has also caught the attention of critics and audiences alike. He had a special on HBO, also got a lot of great reviews. And I think he's doing something different from these three men, which again speaks to not just the moment that he's working in, but also, again, these broader dynamics of race and racialization and masculinity and the type of comedy that will give him the social legibility that he's seeking.
You just said the term racializing. Can you say a little bit more about racializing Islam within the United States or just society in general right now? I'm wondering more about that particular term.
Yeah. So when I say racialized, I'm speaking specifically about the fact that, Muslims ostensibly are not a race, right? If Muslims are practitioners of Islam and Islam is a religion, on face, at least, within the operative categories of how we think about our social worlds, that would not qualify as race. And yet, we see a lot of kind of muddied overlap in the ways that Muslims then are spoken of and the ways that they've even imagined themselves. Um, within this language of racecraft. And so I think that's very much the case for these three comedians that I'm looking at. A lot of that comes out of the very rampant anti-Muslim hostility that we find in places like the US, and the need to counter that hostility. And we see the desire to counter it happening in the academy, happening in social justice activism. But I argue that that's resulted in the use of racial nomenclature as the primary frame through which to then understand Muslim identities. So it results in a language of racial overlay that is eclipsing religious identities and difference, because it fits, again, very well into the secular structures that we have in place of multiculturalism and diversity, right? When Islam acts like a race, it's not so problematic, right? Racialization is fomented, I would say, by, and in the book, I'm going to be calling this a progressive consensus of recognition, where, this centuries long kind of transnational history of labor practices and empire are being impelled, especially in the last several years, by populist responses to the 2016 presidential election, these flagrant calls for institutionalizing anti Muslim hostility. We get this category of race being used to then understand and combat the hostility that Muslims are facing. So, religion then ceases to kind of maintain a connection to the material and the body. If we think of religion in this way as something that people simply believe and they have in their heads and that's it, um, we end up with a fairly limited definition of religion. But not just that, it's a very Protestant definition of
Yeah.
religion, where religion, the reality is, religion lives out in many more places than just our heads and our hearts. But we're thinking about it only in terms of this interiority and individualized belief.
That's so fascinating. So, Sama, you have such an interesting range of scholarship, but you also are talking about things that people are seeing in front of their very eyes when they turn on their televisions at the end of the week and they're like, I want to see a comedy special, or I want to see the next episode of Patriot Act, or you know what I
Yeah.
mean? So you're talking about things that are much more relevant to everybody's daily lives than might be for other scholars and other areas of religious studies. And so you have these important messages to get out about what people are seeing and how to think about what they're watching on their televisions on Netflix and Hulu and things like that, and how to see it differently and with from a wider scope and with wider vision. And I just love that. So using that as like the jumping off point, I want to know about your current collaborations with Sacred Rites a little bit, because you have these messages to to get out and convey to the wider public. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you're doing in order to make sure that happens with this public scholarship initiative.
Yeah, and I think I'll add, that was precisely the reason I wanted to center pop culture in my research, is because in a lot of ways it's one of the most accessible archives, if we can call it that, right? It's an
Yeah.
archive that isn't, in a dusty old library in London somewhere, but something that we're all interacting with on a daily basis, and is informing, again, these popular discourses and notions and ways of thinking about race and gender and secularism, and what are American principles and what defines us as a people. So, my work for Sacred Rites has been really exciting in that way, because I'm getting to learn about how to kind of reach the people who are already interacting with the archive that I'm working with. One thing I've really liked in particular, which I haven't done very much. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, but I'm a lurker. Is learning how to do these Twitter threads that I personally, I know you probably as well, learn a lot from. I get a lot of my information from social media and
Yeah.
Twitter threads. And, of course, you do additional research on top of that and don't just run with what you read on social media. But
Right.
um, this is one of those places where you can, yeah, reach a wide variety of people and a large number of them. So, in terms of my skill set growing, I would say there's the typical academic who might only want to or be interested in writing for a small audience, or an audience that is already maybe familiar with the terms of the debates that they are engaging in. I'm interested in bringing the terms of those debates out a little bit further and seeing how folks outside of the academy conceptualize these things. And honestly, I think in that way, it means that our conversation partners are not limited to just people with PhDs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and involves folks whose very lived experiences speak to the things that we're writing about and reading about. And so Sacred Rights has done a lot in that respect for kind of broadening those horizons.
Do you have any particular goals for general public scholarship? What are some projects that you may be working on or in development that you're excited about?
Well, the semester has just started, so in a lot of ways, those projects have been put on the back burner as
Pause.
we kick off classes. But there's a lot of stuff that I'm hoping to get out there, hopefully through websites like the Conversation or the Revealer, or again, using social media and Twitter threads as a way to kind of reach a wider variety of people. Those are things that I'm hoping to kind of take on in the next year and keep the conversation going.
I love it. Well, I'm wondering if you can just like give people a sense of where they can find you if they would like to know more, if they would like to follow along with the work that you're doing, and just kind of tell everybody where to find you.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Samah Choudhury. You can also get in touch. I think my email is available on the Ithaca College's website if you'd like to speak directly. Otherwise, I'm around. Fortunately, I think one of the very few good things to kind of come out of this last year is uh, we're all maybe a little bit too tied to our computers, but that also means that I'm accessible in a way perhaps that I might not have been before. And so folks can find me.
I love it. Well, Dr. Samah Choudhury, thank you so much for spending some time with me today to talk about your fabulous work. The Hasan Minhaj connection really captivated me right off the bat because I've seen all of his show, and this helps push me in my own thinking. Besides just being a passive consumer of content like this, you're helping me to reframe my own learning and my own understanding with what I consume in pop culture anyway. So this is a useful conversation for people like me as well. So I'm just really grateful to you for your work and for coming on and hanging out with me.
Thank you so much.